Aloha, this is Dedon Kamathi with Freedom Now agenda for the Saturday, September 24th, with a live interview with Mahdi Nazemroaya, the last alternative journalist in Libya. He has researched and unmasked the web of lies that were the rationale for the U.S.-led NATO invasion. This AFRICOM's first adventure into Africa will surely spawn so-called humanitarian wars, that's to say, humanitarian wars in the Sudan, Zimbabwe, among other imperialist nations. The role of the National Endowment for Democracy and other non-profit NGOs was a Trojan horse, psychological war used for the recolonization of Africa. Sister Cynthia McKinney and Don DeBar will join us in this discussion. So stay tuned, tell a friend, and remember, tonight's program can be reheard for the next 2 months at kpfk.org under audio archives. Scroll to Freedom Now to hear this program as well as prior programs. And as always, we stand ready for the revolution. We have the answers to all of your problems. War, war, war. We will follow with a clip from 4-star U.S. Army General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."
The Russian Premier also said NATO has effectively joined one of the warring sides in the conflict, and more responsible action should be taken instead.
The coalition said destroying Gaddafi was not their goal. Then why bomb his palaces? Now some officials have claimed that eliminating him was in fact their goal. Who gave them that right? Did he have a fair trial? Returning to the no-fly zone, the bombings are destroying the country's entire infrastructure. When the so-called civilized world uses all its military power against a small country, destroying what's been created by generations.
Here he added, there are several other parts of the region in the Middle East and North Africa which is facing pretty much civil war situations, but which the West is either ignoring or not really paying the same amount of attention to. Now, I've been speaking to military analysts here in Brussels, and they confirm that ground troops are already in operation in Libya. This is not being covered by the media in the European Union, but troops are already in operation, and they are pushing forward in Libya with Colonel Gaddafi as the target.
Daniel Bushell live there in Brussels.
While more speculation has been raised on the reasons for NATO's intervention in Libya. And as RT's Laura Emmett reports, the organisation may have been trying to prevent Gaddafi from burying the American buck.
Some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret. because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in 96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested, and I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
Yeah, war. We'd like to welcome to Southern California our prior guest, Don DeBar from WBIX in New York, former Congresswoman, Green Party presidential candidate, and in my opinion, the most revolutionary, progressive congressperson in the history of the United States, former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, and Mahdi Nazemroaya. Welcome to KPFK and Freedom Now.
Well, thank you so much, Dedon, for having us on again, and it is really a pleasure for me to be on with Mahdi Nazemroaya, who was among the very last of the alternative independent journalists to leave Libya. And this young man, besides just being absolutely courageous and valiant, is passionate and eloquent. And I guess I should say he's eloquent in his passion. And he has so much information, and that's what we are lacking now that he and the others who were there with him are no longer there. We are constantly bombarded by the CNN and the Fox and all of them, including the New York Times and, the Washington Post, but we're not getting the story. Mahdi will tell us a bit of the story that is the truth tonight.
Assalamu alaikum, my brother.
Thank you for having me. Alaikum
salam. In terms of this notion, Libya and the Big Lie, using...
Can I ask Mahdi to speak up a little bit because I can't hear him very well?
Yeah, can you hear me better now?
Yes, that's much better.
This notion of Libya and the Big Lie, using human rights organizations to launch war, can you elaborate upon that?
All right. Before I do, I want to thank Cynthia. I'm really humbled by what she said and by her support. And I want to say one other thing. You played General Clark's statement. Well, this shows that there was a premeditated objective of attacking Libya. So legally, you need actus reus, you need an act, and you need motivation, and there's a crime right there. So what is happening in Libya is criminal, because they already had the intention of attacking Libya, And you heard it from General Clark, who's the Supreme Commander of NATO. So everything else it means is a pretext. So we should be very clear about that. Doesn't matter what they say, human rights, women's rights, poverty, democracy. These are all pretexts for their barbaric war of aggression against Libya and the entire African continent. Now, turning the gears and talking about human rights, it was human rights organizations, or so-called human rights organizations, I should say, that came up with one of the original allegations against the Libyan government, the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, and this was that Gaddafi was killing his people in Benghazi, 6,000 people. This was made by the Libyan Human Rights League, which is based in Geneva, and Dr. Slimane Bouchigir was the man from the Libyan League for Human Rights who made these claims, and they were never verified in Geneva or in New York City by the United Nations Security Council. So they went to war without any evidence, and they used human rights as an excuse. The head of the Libyan League for Human Rights, number one, is a friend and connected to members of the Libyan Transitional Council, which was based in Benghazi. He was friends of individuals who subsequently, or at the time, became members of that body. Not only that, he has written a thesis about destroying any country's potential, specifically the Arab countries, but it can be applied to the African continent, to development there, to Asia, Latin America, to Russia. He specifically he authored a thesis about how to prevent them on using the oil weapon or their economies as weights in international relations. And this was very heavily relied upon in strategic circles in the United States, and he's quoted many times. You can find his work been quoted many times. Going back to his allegations in Geneva, he made the allegations of 6,000 people, as I said, were killed in Benghazi. Never verified. Not only that, he got 70 NGOs to write a letter to the U.S., the EU, and the UN, and personal letters were written to Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, to President Barack Hussein Obama of the United States, and to the EU High Commissioner, Catherine Ashton. They also got letters on February 21st, 2011. And if you look at this list of 70 NGOs, you're going to see that they include United Nations Watch, which is essentially looks out for the interests of Israel, UN Watch, and it's also targeting Syria now. It includes other organizations which have worked against Sudan, which work against Cuba, which work against Venezuela, which work against Russia. These are organizations that have been accused of being used as fronts to demonize specific countries that are outside of the orbit of the United States and the European Union. And if you go through the list of their letter that they sent on February 21st, 2011, and you read the allegations they make, and you read the signatories, you would ask your officials to be far more responsible, and you would ask, you want the United Nations and demand that the United Nations Security Council investigate. You can't. There's something called due legal process. Nobody is guilty everybody's innocent until proven guilty. That's the way it works. But it seems these rules don't apply to specific countries or to specific leaders like Colonel Muammar Gaddafi in Libya.
You know, my major concern is not just Brother Gaddafi, but the tens of thousands of Libyan people, the destruction of internal economic, social infrastructure, the elimination of healthcare, of education, of housing. The oil fields have now been privatized. There's been a total demolishing of the number one economy, social system in the whole of Africa with this onslaught. And so this is a position why Freedom Now, for instance, is continually to expose the contradictions in terms of this allegation of the Jamahiriya being anti-people, when in fact they're pro-people, and the new government that's coming into power is being controlled by multinational corporations and is anti-people.
You know, I'd like to add something here. This is a very, very important point that Mahdi has brought out, because what the research that he has just provided us indicates that there was one man who was willing to put forward the lie onto the international scene and then use his friendships, his relationships with people who were similarly situated in the human rights community, or the so-called human rights community, to get them to become signatories to this letter. And the bombing that we see, the collective punishment, the massacres, the targeted assassination attempts, the actual assassinations that have taken place, have all been the result of this little group of people who decided that bombing the heck out of Libya, their own country, was preferable to struggling inside the country for whatever their policy objectives were.
I'm looking at the signature list for urgent action on Libya. I'm looking at 85 so-called NGOs or Chinese writers, National Endowment for Democracy, which seems to be the major financier of not only destabilization in Libya, but historically has been used for destabilization in Chile, among other societies, in terms of the destruction of democratic regimes. Don.
Yeah, yep. You know, there's something that's interesting that bears directly on this. Only a month prior to this letter, in February, there was a draft report issued by the United Nations that listed the conditions inside Libya with respect to the political conditions, including the judicial system, the economic conditions, the social conditions. And if you read that report, you know, you'd want to elect somebody in the United States that could do that here. Mm-hmm. And this was issued by the United Nations. It was prepared in December and presented in January. And yet a month later, based on no evidence, I mean, Mahdi's very clear about this, and he's absolutely correct. There was no fact-finding done. Gaddafi even was saying, bring people here and come look before you act. See if these things have happened. And the allegation about, for example, that there were aerial attacks on civilians in Benghazi and Brega, the Russian foreign minister said, you know, okay, you say this happened on this day and this day. Here's the satellite photographs from our military satellites. There was no aerial activity there at all. These things were presented, you know, in other words, there was no evidence, but what allegations were made, to the extent that there were any material ones, they were rebutted, and there was no fact-finding done, and yet, you know, what is it now, 7, 8, 9 months bombing campaign is going on there, you know, since March 19th.
But now this is strikingly similar to the modus operandi that was used with respect to Afghanistan. I have since learned that immediately after September 11th, the ministerial level meeting of NATO members was called. And at that meeting, the ministers were told by the Americans, the people of the United States, that we know who did it. We've got the evidence, but we can't share it with you. But we want you to go and launch a war in Afghanistan. And on the basis, again, of no evidence, the NATO then went into Afghanistan and began to bomb and kill and use depleted uranium and just absolutely destroy that country, and now have extended it into Pakistan as well. So I think Mahdi's research is critical, and I thank you, Dedon, for having Mahdi on, and I hope that you'll make his article available so that people can go and read for themselves. I had not had the opportunity to read that letter until Mahdi put it out there with the signatories. And it just so happens that during the time that all of this was supposed to have taken place, there was a delegation in Tripoli that was being received by the entire leadership of Libya, because they were bringing Africans and people in the African diaspora in to try and rebuild Africa, starting with Libya, if it is impossible for people of African descent to live in dignity where they are in the diaspora. The invitation was to come back home. At the very moment that this conference was taking place, it is when the letter alleges that these helicopter gunships and all of this was turned against the people of Libya. So this is an amazing piece of evidence now that there actually is no evidence whatsoever.
Just let me add to that too. The prior piece that you played, where they were talking about the gold dinar, for people to understand that if there were an African currency, gold-backed African currency no less, but even just an African currency printed in Africa, that would mean that the African economy, which is this resource-rich continent that everyone has been sucking the blood out of, human blood, resource blood, for, 5 centuries now, that would finally be under the control of the African people. And this was a project that was underway and that was being led and funded by Gaddafi. And at the same time that this project is going forward, he's doing this kind of organizing on the continent. You can imagine, of course, what that means to the colonial powers that have plans for the resources and the people of Africa that don't include them making any decisions.
What's interesting...
I have a question for Mahdi to bring this all together, which he can sort of help us with. And for me, there's been this allusion to Libya being a part of the Arab Spring. With the information that was given by Wesley Clark, the presence of the finance by the National Endowment for Democracy and other Western organizations through NGOs that helped all of this to take place, where does Libya fit in to what has become known as the Arab Spring?
Well, first, this is not an issue about democracy. It is not about Arab agency. They used human rights, as I said, and the notion that people are struggling for democracy as a pretext. It's very clear now. It should be very clear to everybody that this was pre-planned. We have the minutes. We have the conference papers that they're talking about a transitional council about. They're talking about, they funded this. The National Endowment for Democracy, for example, in 2006 talked about decentralizing Libya. It is Chatham House. They all talk about a transitional council. Meetings were going on since 1990, and the current oil and finance minister for the transitional council was at all these meetings. He was at every single meeting about regime change in Libya by the so-called Libyan opposition, by the Libyan Salvation Front, these people. So this is not an Arab Spring. Of course, there's people that are unhappy, and I think the leader of the Nation of Islam put it very well. In every country, there are people who are upset. People are always upset about something, but there's certain people that are very conniving, and they go into these countries, and they utilize those internal tensions, and they try to manipulate it and use it for their own interests, and that's what they're doing in Libya and the Arab world. Believe me, because an Arab Spring is not going to be it's not going to be brought by NATO. Democracy is not going to be brought by NATO bombs.
Okay, we're going to take a quick station ID. We're coming back.
You're listening to KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, where there's a film showing tonight for free The Legend of Bhagat Singh, which is the life story of India's legendary Marxist revolutionary martyr, sentenced to death for standing up to British colonialism. Doors open soon at 6 p.m. and the film begins at 7 p.m. It's at the Workers' Solidarity Center at 1905 Rodeo Road, Los Angeles, California, 90018.
Yeah, we have about 4 minutes left of the show. We're listening to Mahdi, former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney, and Don DeBar. Brother Mahdi, you were continuing?
I said it, but we have to seriously hold these organizations to account that are hiding behind things like human rights, women's rights, democracy, because they actually do the opposite in these countries. All the transitional council bodies that have been established by the United States, and I'm not talking about just the one in Libya, I'm talking about in Kosovo, in Iraq, that includes the coalition, the Provisional Coalition Authority, and what was there before it. They've all lasted for a long time and privatized the resources there. They've privatized the infrastructure, and they've broken down the social programs. These are colonial administrations. You know, and in Afghanistan, the same thing's going on as well. There's privatization in NATO-occupied Afghanistan, which is resource-rich, but it hasn't been developed. And since I brought up the issue of development, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in a tangent. I have to say something since we were talking about Africa. The Minister of International Cooperation for Libya, at a meeting with me and others at the Libyan Foreign Ministry, and the Director for the Libyan Foreign Investments made it very clear that the United States and certain Western European countries, including the European Union as a whole, told the Libyan government that they were not happy with what Libya was doing in Africa, that the development projects went against their national interests and their corporate interests in Africa. They want Africa to be a place where you can just take the resources, manufacture it outside of the continent, bring it back and sell it for 15 to 20 times what it's worth, and in the process indebt and enslave those countries further. And they were very unhappy about this, as well as other international players. And this is very important to understand, because this war in Libya has caused famine in other parts of Africa, and it's also stopped development projects, frozen them, stopped them in their tracks in other parts of Africa. And people in other parts of Africa have lost their jobs, you know, and it was amazing to see how foreign workers were treated in Libya from other parts of Africa, from Asia and Eastern Europe. They were treated very well. And I've never seen it before in I haven't seen it at all to the level of the treatment they received in Libya. Like Filipino workers were free to dress the way they would in their own country, and they weren't suppressed. And I spoke to them about how they were treated. And they went to other countries like Lebanon, the UAE, Qatar, and they said those places are horrendous, but here it's very different. We can settle down, we can build lives here.
Just to contextualize it, when Mahdi said that people are starving to death in Africa, developmental projects have stopped, what he's referring to is that Libya, with the billions of dollars of oil wealth, was channeling that oil wealth for the development of Africa, particular projects in the states of Africa, financing programs to stop famine, financing electrical infrastructure development throughout Africa. That's what he's referring to. Go on, Brother Mahdi.
Okay, and we were talking about currency. You know, 14 countries in Africa use the franc. The French control their fiscal policy. They're de facto colonies. When somebody controls your monetary policy and your economy in such a manner, you're not independent. What type of independence is it when somebody tells you what to fiscally do? You know, your banking is very central to your sovereignty. You know, and the Gaddafi wanted to get rid of this, and the Libyans wanted to get rid of this, and other Pan-African individuals wanted to get rid of this, and the French didn't like this. This was against their turf. This is a war against Africa. It's not just against Libya, and we have to be very clear about that. We have to be very clear that Libya is opening the gateway to Africa. If this country was left alone, it would have been like what Germany was to post-World War II Europe. It would have been the engine of development in that continent. And they just halted everything in its tracks. And it was deliberate. I can tell you, for example, the French, they bombed some places nobody understood why those places were being bombed. They bombed certain roads, like the Saladin Highway. It was later that people found out that French companies were building telecommunication cables down there. They were almost complete.
We're out of time. We're out of time, my brother. We thank you. Brother Don, thank you very much. And Ms. McKinney, we thank you. This is part one of a series.
This is part one of a series, and we will be back next week with more from Mahdi Nazemroaya.
Thank you, Don. Thank you, Brother Mahdi.
Can I give you a website real quick?
Go ahead.
You go to wbaix.blogspot.com is a copy of Mahdi's report. wbaix.blogspot.com.
We thank you. I'd like to thank Sister Tanya, Tej, DJ G, Ty, and all those who make tonight's programs possible. And remember, as always, we stand ready for the revolution.